Okay, we talked a little bit in the preceding part about customer relationship management. And what I want to talk about are different worldviews. And it sounds pretty theoretical, but there's a reason why we're talking about these worldviews of what constitutes a relationship. The Anglo-Aussie perspective, and some of these labels are ones that are attributions that I've given it. The Anglo-Aussie perspective of relationships is one that's largely predicated on a service quality dimension. How do we provide more and more service? Now, I'm going to give you the other end of each of these perspectives. Can we just indiscriminately provide more and more and more service to every customer without a cost? The answer, quite simply, is no. There are costs associated with every service that we provide, and there are some customers that warrant greater attention to service than others. We like to say we meet and exceed all customers' expectations, but the fact of the matter and the challenge to the Anglo-Aussie perspective is sometimes we have to offer varying levels of service quality because it's the most cost-efficient and effective way to protect our best customers and retain the customers that have an opportunity to be retained. And we'll talk a little bit about that with my pruning principle. Then there's the Scandinavian perspective. And the Scandinavian perspective is not too much unlike the Anglo-Aussie perspective. But the Scandinavian said, in the supply chain, basically service quality is a dyadic process. There are flows that go back and forth between the supply chain and the demand chain, and that it's kind of a negotiating of service quality along the way. And in fact, it's a markedly different perspective than what we call the IMP perspective, which is Industrial Marketing and Purchasing Group, which is largely born out of University of Bath, but it's a very European tradition. And that says in industrial marketing settings that basically transaction cost and neo-institutional economics reigns, that there's always going to be opportunism, and what we're doing in relationship marketing is reducing the opportunism so that we can isolate cost. But can we really isolate the cost of managing a customer? That's only true if you believe that everything can be quantified, because there are qualitative costs and qualitative benefits that are very difficult to measure. And it's one of the challenges to the IMP approach. The Chinese management principle that's based largely on guanxi suggests that there are filial relationships and that organizations work very much like companies. And this has lasted for hundreds of years, and it still exists in contemporary market settings throughout Asia today, the principle of guanxi. And there's a similar principle in South America and the Middle East. The problem with the Chinese perspective is it's not necessarily conducive to the kind of competitive settings that we have in Europe, much of the Western world, the US, Canada, etc. So it may be applicable to that market area, but as you look at the global marketplace, it becomes more and more challenging to maintain that Chinese perspective, because do we have guanxi in a normal relationship between two US companies? Maybe not. And finally, there are a number of North American perspectives. In Jagdish Sheth's view, relationship management is all about reducing choice. By reducing customer choice, it means some things get out of our evoked set, the set that we're cognitively considering as an alternative. So for any good or service that you buy, and you might think of it as a buyer for a manufacturer, maybe there's 2 or 3 maybes, candidates out there. So the prospects get smaller and smaller. And it goes back to the introductory model where I talked about this massive aggregation through merger and acquisition. Well, what comes out of that whole, what is the precipitate from that aggregation? Reduced choice. So it's not just something that's stimulated by buyers and sellers on an individual level or organizations at a corporate level, but it's something that all stakeholders are very involved in. Then there's a Hunt and Morgan perspective. And Shelby Hunt and Bob Morgan said, basically it's all predicated on trust and commitment. The problem is, there's not one view of trust or commitment. There's varying levels of trust and commitment. They're basically a continuum. You can trust somebody a lot, a moderate amount. And how much trust is there in a relationship? Are there differences between industries? And I would argue that there are. The Pelton-Lush perspective is one that's probably most clearly identified with the content of what we talk about a great deal in this course, which is supply chain management. Supply chain management in a global marketplace consists of a myriad or a portfolio of different types, an array of relationships. Not all relationships are the same. The argument is that relationships have to be managed both among and between each channel. That means that if you're doing business with Honeywell Corporation, okay, and I'm buying goods from Honeywell Corporation, I'm the buyer, Honeywell's the seller, it's not just that relationship, but my relationship extends to other suppliers who may be related to the same end product, where I use some Honeywell components, and I may use some GE components. And we might think about aeronautics as a good example, where you have a lot of components that come together from a lot of different manufacturers. How do we put them all together, not just in terms of just-in-time production, but in terms of quality standards and making sure that they harmonize together? So our perspective is one that largely champions or advocates customer relationship management as something that goes both ways and across all hubs and networks of channels. And it recognizes that some relationships are essentially networks. Okay? Now, when we talk about those relational components, I gave you very theoretical terms, and you're probably, okay, I heard all the world views, but what does it really come down to? I think it comes down to these things. One, it fortifies sustainable market value. What's the market value of that buyer or seller? And we've seen market values diminish to negative values across different industries. My argument is that it was not in tune with relational components. The second component is one that has to do with the myths that underlie all customer relationship management. And it really emerges as Pelton's pruning principle. You hear a lot about the 80-20 rule. We get 80% of our business from 20% of our customers. It's false. It's a myth. Okay? It depends on who you consider customers. Is it anybody you sell to? So part of that myth has to do with the definition of customer. The other part of the myth is those best customers that are identified by every company in every sector are the same ones that your competition wants. It's not as if you have a portfolio of customers that are your best that nobody else wants. And the idea is, the good news is, if you can keep switching costs high, then there's a disincentive to switch. The bad news is, if switching costs are high, it's hard to get those competitors' best customers. Okay, so think about how that works out. Really what we find in most companies is that it's the second-tier customers, your tier 2 customers, that offer the best prospect, not only for customer retention, but actually providing long-term sustainable market value to you. And that goes to ROI and return on customer. And you'll have a separate segment on my pruning principle, but basically it's how do we weed out. You know, if you think about pruning a tree to allow it to grow better and better and fuller and make it look the way you want to in the right direction, you really have to prune the trees and the limbs and so forth. And that's basically what we're talking about. You know, all these branches that come out of the tree, we have to analyze. And, you know, in a tree, it's analyzing it down to sap and the bark and everything down to the soil and the components of the soil and external factors like the water and the weather and the humidity and the conditions that the tree grows in. Well, my pruning principle, which I've done for many companies, I have 4 basic tenets. The idea of recognition, reward, retention, and what I call rejuvenation. And we'll talk more about that later. But a relational component is, how do we go about picking the customers that are prospects for retaining as opposed for the throwaway customer? And it's the most difficult sell I ever have in consulting, telling some companies you need to get rid of customers, that they're costing you too much, and that those resources would be better allocated to better customers or emerging customers. And finally, what are the bottom line results? We can talk all day about relationalism, but there's one thing you have to recognize. Relationalism isn't a panacea for success. Some things are very transactional by nature. we are constantly managing transactions. As they become very routinized and there's less and less specialization to it, there are those companies that operate best under a transactional template because it offers the best bottom line results.